AS-17 segment reporting. What is the objective of this accounting standard? To understand the performance, assess the risk and the returns of the enterprise, and forming a judgment about the enterprise as a whole. Now, on which enterprises is this accounting standard applicable? On listed companies, companies which are in the process of listing, or any other commercial, industrial, business reporting enterprises whose turnover exceeds 50 crore rupees. Now, the segment whichever is required to be disclosed will be called as reportable segment. Now, these reportable segment can be of two types. First one is business segment and the second one is geographical segment. When we talk about business segment, we are talking about distinguishing the components of a company on the basis of the products, services, or a group of products or services, and whose risks and returns are different than other business segments. Example: nature of product or services, nature of production process, type of customer for product or services, method used to distribute product, render service, right? So this will be called as business segment. When we talk about geographical segment, we talk about distinguishing on the basis of the economic environment in which the company is working, and whose risk and returns are different from the components operating in other economic environments. Example: similarity in the economic and political conditions, proximity of operations, special risks in particular area, exchange control regulation, underlying currency risks. So these are the example of geographical segment. All right. Now there are some technical terms which we need to understand before going ahead. First is enterprise revenue and segment revenue. When we talk about enterprise revenue, we are talking about revenue from sale of external customers, and as reported as in the profit and loss account. All right. So that is called as enterprise revenue. When we talk about segment revenue, it is summation of three things. First, portion of enterprise revenue directly attributable to segment, that is external sales to customers. Second, relevant portion of enterprise revenue that can be allocated on a reasonable basis to a segment. And third, revenue from transactions with other segments of the enterprise. That means that the inter segment sales. All right. Now, the certain things are excluded when we talk about segment revenue, which are not included. What are not included? First, the extraordinary items in AS5, that is net profit or loss for the period, prior items, and change in accounting policies. Second, interest or dividend income, including interest on loan, advances to other segments, unless operations of segments are primarily of financial nature. Third, gain on sale of investments or on extinguishment of debt, unless operations of the segment are primarily of financial nature. So these three things will not be included in segment revenue. Three things will be included: sales which are specifically from a segment, sales which are apportioned, which can be allocated on a reasonable basis to a segment, and inter-segment sales that will be included. Three things will be included in segment revenue. When we talk about enterprise revenue, it is only to external customers. Sale to external customers as reported in the statement of profit and loss will be considered as enterprise revenue. Okay. Now, when we next technical term is segment expense. Now, what are segment expenses? Expenses that are directly attributable to a segment, or and the relevant portion of enterprise expenses that are allocable on a reasonable basis to a segment will be considered as segment expenses. Okay. In this, five items will not be included. What items? First, extraordinary items as in AS5. Second, interest expenses. And third, loss on sale of investments. Fourth, in income tax expenses. And fifth, the general administrative expenses, head office expenses not incurred specifically for the segment. If anything is incurred specifically, then obviously that will be included in the segment expenses. Third term is segment result. When we talk about segment result, we are basically talking about operating profit of a segment. What will be that? Segment revenue minus segment expenses. Next, segment asset. When we assets which are used to earn segment revenue, right? Those will be called as segment assets. Assets directly employed by the segment in operation plus allocable to segment on reasonable basis plus investments receivable whose income is included in segment. So segment assets will include three things. First, which are directly employed by the segment. Second, allocable to the segment. And third, investments receivable or whose income is included in the segment will be, these three things will be considered as segment asset. It will not include income tax assets such as deferred tax assets or something like that. All right. However, if there are any provisions or allowances which are direct offsets from the balance sheet items which are deducted from the assets, they will be included. All right, like provision for doubtful debts, right? They will be included. Next, segment liabilities. They are basically the creditors or their, if they're bill payables or outstanding expenses which are to be included to a specific segment. Liabilities directly resulting from operating activities, relevant portion attributable to reasonable debts, interest bearing liabilities whose interest expenses included in segment result, but it will also exclude income tax liabilities such as deferred tax liabilities. All right. Next, segment accounting policies. Segment accounting policies matlab policies of apportionment of certain things to segments, different segments. Policies adopted for preparing and presenting financial statements of an enterprise and to segment reporting. All right. Next, now we have understood different technical terms. Now there are two segments which I have already explained, a business segment and geographical segment, but only one of them will be a primary segment and the second one, the remaining one, will be considered as a secondary format or a secondary segment. All right. Now, the two segments which are reportable, business segment and geographical segment, one of them will be primary and the other one will be secondary. All right. Now, which one will be primary? It will be determined on a dominant source and nature of risk and return. If the risk and return predominantly is affected by difference in product and services, it reduces, or strongly affect both by difference in business or services and geographical areas, then in that case it will be the business segment which will be primary and the geographical segment will be secondary. But if the risk and returns affected by the operation in different countries or geographical areas, then in that case the primary segment will be geographical segment. All right. And the secondary will be then business segment by default. All right. So that was how we decide the primary and secondary segment of segment report. Now, we have already identified which will be a primary segment, which will be a secondary segment. Now, we need to identify which one of the business segments will be displayed in the segment reporting and which one of the geographical segments will be presented on the segment reporting, right? So, for that, there are three rules which are which the identification depends. All right. The first one is the revenue from the sale to external customer and from transactions with other segment is 10% or more of the total revenue, external and internal, of all the segments, right? So that will be the first revenue. 10% या उससे ज़्यादा है तो फिर उस केस में जिसका भी 10% या उससे ज़्यादा है, that segment will be reportable. All right. Second one, तीन जो ये रूल्स हैं सबके बीच में और है, और का मतलब है कि हर एक सेगमेंट में जो जो सेगमेंट, हर एक रूल में जो जो सेगमेंट्स आते रहेंगे उन सबको रिपोर्ट करना पड़ेगा. ठीक है. द सेकंड वन इज segment result, whether profit or loss is 10% or more of combined result of all the segments in profit or combined result of all the segments in loss, whichever is greater in absolute amount. ठीक है. So अगर 10% और मोर का प्रॉफिट या लॉस का शेयर है किसी भी सेगमेंट का, तो उस केस में उस सेगमेंट को भी हमें रिपोर्ट करना पड़ेगा. एंड द लास्ट वन, इट्स segment assets are 10% or more of the total assets of all the segments. ठीक है. अगर segment asset किसी भी segment के 10% से ज्यादा है total assets के, तो वो segment भी reportable होगा. ठीक है. Now see, if the total external revenue attributable to the reported segment is less than 75% of total enterprise revenue, additional segments be prepared as reporting segments even if they do not meet the 10% criteria, unless at least 75% of the total enterprise revenue is included in reportable segments. मतलब कि अगर 75% का नहीं बन रहा है टोटल शेयर जितने की रिपोर्टेबल सेगमेंट्स हुए हैं, तो कुछ और सेगमेंट्स को भी हमें सेलेक्ट करना पड़ेगा जिनका 10% से कम है शेयर तो भी. ठीक है. उसके बाद Segment included as reportable segment due to 10% thresholds be continued to be reported segment for current period as well, even though this year 10% threshold is not met. So suppose there are three segments A, B, C, and the segment reportable in the current year is A, B, C, D. Right. In current year, only A and B are reportable as per the rules, but in previous year, according to the rules, A, B, and C were reportable. In that case, in current year also, C will also be reported because as per the written rule which I spoke, the segment which was reportable in the previous year but is not reportable in the current year will also be reported. It doesn't matter whether it is reportable as per the rules or not. All right, and same applies to current year as well. मतलब अगर A, B, C and D, there are four segments, and the segment D is suppose is reportable. So in that case, the previous year's data will of D will also be reported. It doesn't matter that D was reportable or not in the previous year as per the rules. All right, so that is the point here. Next, segment information be prepared in conformity with the accounting policies adopted by the company or enterprise for preparing and presenting financial statements as a whole. Assets and liabilities relating jointly to two or more segments will be allocated to segments if and only if their related revenues and expenses also are allocated to those segments. All right, so if there are any assets and liabilities which are represented by two or more segments, all right, and the revenue from those revenue or expenses from those assets and liabilities can also be divided among different segments, then only the assets and liabilities will also be allocable, otherwise not. All right, otherwise they will be presented as unallocated assets and liabilities. All right, then a reconciliation of segment revenue with enterprise revenue, segment result with the net profit or loss, segment assets and liabilities with the enterprise assets and liabilities will be presented. So reconciliation relating to three things: first, segment revenue with enterprise revenue; second, segment result with net profit or loss; third, segment assets and liabilities with the enterprise assets and liabilities will be presented in the segment report. All right, measuring and reporting segment revenue from transactions with other segments. Inter-segment transfers be measured on the basis of actual prices for those transfers. All right, and the last one, changes in accounting policies have a material effect on the segment information will be disclosed. If there are any changes in the accounting policies by the company and which have a very material effect on the segment information which is to be disclosed, then in that case you need to disclose the change in the accounting policy as well. All right, then now we have understood which segments are to be considered as primary, which segments are to be considered as secondary, which segments are to be reported. Now, what is to be reported? What disclosures are to be made? When we talk about primary segment, we have to make 8 disclosures. First, segment revenue from sales to external customers. Second, segment revenue from transactions with other segments. Third, segment result. Fourth, carrying amount of segment assets. Fifth, segment liabilities. Sixth, cost incurred in acquiring tangible and intangible fixed assets during the year. Seventh, depreciation and amortization. And the last, non-cash expenses other than depreciation and amortization in respect of segment assets. Okay? Now, if an enterprise report the amount of cash flows arising from operating, investing, and financial activities of a segment, need not disclose depreciation and amortization expenses and non-cash expenses of such segment. मतलब कि अगर कैश फ्लो स्टेटमेंट सेगमेंट वाइज बनी है तो उस केस में नॉन कैश एक्सपेंसेस, डेप्रिसिएशन, अमोर्टाइजेशन दिखाने की जरूरत नहीं है, अलग से डिस्क्लोज करने की जरूरत नहीं है. ठीक है. नाउ, डिस्क्लोजर रिक्वायरमेंट फॉर एन एंटरप्राइज, वो पहले ही हमने पढ़ लिया कि reconciliation between the information disclosed for a reportable segment and the aggregate information of an enterprise financial results will be there, right? Revenue, net profit and loss, assets and liabilities, वो हमने पहले ही पढ़ लिया था. Now, secondary segment information. Secondary segment information क्या क्या disclose करना है? प्राइमरी फॉर्मेट इज बिजनेस सेगमेंट. अगर प्राइमरी फॉर्मेट बिजनेस सेगमेंट है तो सेकेंडरी फॉर्मेट ऑब्वियसली ज्योग्राफिकल सेगमेंट होगा. सो उस केस में हमें क्या क्या डिस्क्लोज करना है? तीन चीजें. पहला, रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम एक्सटर्नल कस्टमर बाय लोकेशन ऑफ कस्टमर्स. सेकंड, द assets, carrying amount of assets by the location of assets. Third, cost incurred by in acquiring the tangible and intangible fixed assets by the location of assets. ठीक है, capex basically. Now, अगर प्राइमरी सेगमेंट ज्योग्राफिकल सेगमेंट है तो ज्योग्राफिकल सेगमेंट में दो टाइप का सेगमेंट हो सकता है. पहला, बाय लोकेशन ऑफ असेट, एंड सेकंड बाय लोकेशन ऑफ कस्टमर. राइट. सो ज्योग्राफिकल सेगमेंट में दो टाइप का हो सकता है, लोकेशन ऑफ असेट, लोकेशन ऑफ कस्टमर. सो व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट लोकेशन ऑफ असेट, तीन चीजें डिस्क्लोज करनी है. रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम एक्सटर्नल कस्टमर्स बाय बिजनेस सेगमेंट, बिजनेस सेगमेंट के बेसिस पे आपको डिवाइड करना है. दूसरा, कैरिंग अमाउंट ऑफ सेगमेंट असेट्स बाय बिजनेस सेगमेंट, बाय मतलब उस बेसिस पे. थर्ड, कॉस्ट इनकर्ड इन एक्वायरिंग टैंजिबल एंड इनटैंजिबल फिक्स्ड असेट्स बाय बिजनेस सेगमेंट. फोर्थ, revenue from external customers by geographical customers if different from the location of asset. ठीक है. अब अगर ज्योग्राफिकल सेगमेंट है तो और उसमें प्राइम लोकेशन ऑफ कस्टमर जो है वो उस बेसिस पे हो रहा है, तो उस केस में रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम एक्सटर्नल कस्टमर्स बाय बिजनेस सेगमेंट, कैरिंग अमाउंट ऑफ असेट्स बाय बिजनेस सेगमेंट, cost incurred in acquiring tangible and intangible by business segment, cost incurred in acquiring tangible and intangible fixed assets by location of assets, and carrying amount of segments by location of assets if different from location of customers. So इतना सब कुछ खिचड़ी समझने की जगह हम लोग बस इतना ध्यान रख सकते हैं कि in all the three segments बेसिकली मेन तीन चीजें डिस्क्लोज करनी है. पहला, रेवेन्यू. दूसरा, असेट्स कहाँ क्या क्या कैरिंग अमाउंट है. एंड तीसरा, केपेक्स कितना लगा है असेट्स एक्वायर करने में. ठीक है. सो ये तीन चीजें हमको बेसिकली डिस्क्लोज करनी है फाइनेंशियल इंफॉर्मेशन के तौर पे फॉर सेकेंडरी सेगमेंट्स. ऑलराइट. नाउ देयर आर सर्टेन अदर सेगमेंट रिक्वायरमेंट्स. The basis of pricing in inter-segment transfers and changes therein will also be disclosed. Changes in segment accounting policies will be disclosed. Type of product and services in each business segment will be disclosed. Composition of each geographical segment will be disclosed. So we have completed the whole accounting standard. What did we understood? First, we understood the objectives, what where it is applicable, what is business segment. Segments can be of two types, geographical and business. One will be a primary, other one will be a secondary segment. And primary segment, there are eight main disclosures to be made. Then we understood one non-disclosure option, and there is a reconciliation which is to be disclosed, which is to be properly shown. And for secondary information, there are mainly three things which are to be disclosed, and there are some other disclosures which are to be made. All right. So this was the main segment reporting. Thank you very much for listening. If I have said anything wrong, please let me know in the comment section. If you have any doubt, please let me know that too in the comment section.